Chapter 1. The air in the high cathedral of Oakhaven smelled of lilies and expensive wax scents that usually signaled a celebration. But to Leo, they felt like the heavy perfumes used to mask the smell of a corpse. Leo stood before a floor-toozling mirror in the vestry, his breath hitching as two attendants pulled the silk stays of his ceremonial tunic. It was white, embroidered with gold threads so fine it looked like sunlight captured in fabric. Around his neck sat the torque of submission, a delicate gold band that would be replaced by Prince Alaric's bite during the ceremony. "You look ethereal, my lord," one of the servants whispered, bowing low. "The prince is a lucky man." Leo forced a smile, but his stomach was a knot of cold lead. He was a high Omega born of a noble line, but possessing a temperament that many in the court called too soft, even for his rank. He had spent 3 years pining for Alaric, the crown prince, whose scent of cedarwood and stormy ozone made Leo's knees weak. To Leo, this wasn't just a political arrangement. It was the fulfillment of a dream. Is he ready?" Leo asked, his voice small. "The prince is at the altar, my lord. The king and the high priest are waiting." Leo took a steadying breath, trying to calm the frantic thrum of his pulse. Through the heavy oak doors, he could hear the low murmur of the gathered nobility, the dukes, the generals, and the foreign dignitaries who had traveled weeks to see the union of the southern crown. He stepped out, his silk train rustling against the marble floor. As the doors swung open, the sunlight hit him, momentarily blinding him. Then he saw him. Leo reached the altar, his hands trembling as he offered them to the prince. Alaric's skin was cold. There was no spark, no rush of the bond that the poets wrote about. Instead, there was a heavy, suffocating silence. The high priest stepped forward, lifting the ceremonial dagger to draw the drop of blood that would seal their souls. "Prince Alaric of Oakhaven, do you accept this Omega as your sovereign mate, to guard, to cherish, and to bind until the stars fade?" Alaric didn't speak. He looked down at Leoreally, looked at Hymena's lip curled in a flicker of disdain that shattered Leo's heart before a single word was even uttered. "No," Alaric said, his voice ringing through the silent cathedral like a thunderclap. "I do not." Chapter 2. The silence that followed Alaric's no was more deafening than any scream. It rippled through the high cathedral, stripping the gold-leafed walls of their splendor until the room felt like nothing more than a cold, hollow tomb. Leo's hands, still offered trustingly to the prince, began to shake. He looked up, searching Alaric's face for a signa-joke, a momentary lapse of reason. A flicker of the affection he thought they shared during those stolen moonlit walks in the palace gardens. But Alaric's eyes were like flint. "Your Highness?" The high priest stammered, the ceremonial dagger trembling in his grip. "The vows, the lineage. The treaty is already signed." "Then tear it up," Alaric commanded, his voice projecting to the very back of the hall. He turned away from Leo, facing the gathered assembly of stunned nobles. A king's mate is meant to be a pillar of strength, a partner in war, and a strategist in peace. He spared a sidelong, scathing glance at Leo's pale, delicate form. "I look at this Omega, and I see a decoration. A fragile bird that will break at the first sign of winter. Oakhaven needs a queen of iron, not silk. I will not tether my soul or my throne to a weakness." A gasp erupted from the pews. Leo felt the blood drain from his face, his skin turning as white as his ceremonial tunic. The torque of submission around his neck suddenly felt like it was choking him, a collar of shame rather than a promise of protection. "Alaric," Leo whispered, his voice cracking. You said I was your light." Alaric didn't even look back. "Every man enjoys the light, Leo. That doesn't mean he wants to be blinded by it when he has a kingdom to rule. Guards escort the Lord of Vallis back to his father's estate. He is no longer a guest of the crown." The humiliation was physical. It felt like a blade twisting in Leo's chest's phantom pain of a bond being rejected before it could fully knit. As the royal guards stepped forward, their heavy boots thudding on the marble, Leo's father, the the Count of Vallis, stood up in the front row. But he didn't move to comfort his son. His face was purple with ragget at the prince, but at Leo. The guards reached for Leo's arms. Leo flinched, pulling away. He looked around the room, seeing the sneers of the rival Omegas who had envied him, the pitying looks of the Alphas, and the cold broad back of the man he had loved. He wasn't a person here. He was a failed investment. A broken doll. With a sudden, desperate surge of energy, Leo didn't wait to be escorted. He turned and ran. He tore the silk train of his gown as he bolted toward the side exit, the gold embroidery catching on the pews. He didn't stop until he hit the cool, biting air of the courtyard, the mocking echoes of the court still ringing in his ears. He knew what waited for him at home, a locked room, a forced marriage to the highest bidder to recoup his father's losses, and a life of quiet, miserable fading. "No," Leo whispered to the wind, his eyes stinging with tears of fury. "If I am too weak for the South, then I will go where the weak go to die. And I will see if the mountains find me as useless as you do." Chapter 3. The silk of Leo's wedding tunic was shredded, the gold embroidery snagging on thorns as he clawed his way through the dense thickets of the borderlands. Behind him, the warm, amber lights of the capital were nothing but a hateful glow on the horizon. Ahead, the sky turned a bruised purple, dominated by the jagged, white-capped teeth of the northern mountains. He had no horse, no guards, and no dowry. All he had was a stolen hunting knife, a heavy traveler's cloak he'd swiped from a stable boy, and a heart that felt like it had been physically hollowed out of his chest. By the second night, the temperature plummeted. The lush, humid air of the south was replaced by a wind that bit through his cloak like a predator's teeth. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. "Too weak," Leo hissed, his teeth chattering so hard he feared they might crack. "Fragile decoration." He stumbled over a frozen root, falling hard into the slush. The phantom pain of the broken bond Maytake flared up in his neck, right where Alaric's teeth should have been. It felt like a hot brand pressing into his skin, a constant reminder that he had been cast aside. He didn't get up. He lay there, his cheek against the freezing mud, watching his own breath bloom in white clouds. "Just sleep," a dark corner of his mind whispered. "The cold is kinder than Alaric was." But then he heard it. A low, guttural growl that vibrated through the earth. Leo's eyes snapped open. Emerging from the shadows of the pines was a frost wolf, a beast the size of a carriage, its fur matted with ice, its eyes glowing with a hungry, pale blue light. It was a scavenger of the peaks, and it had found a dying Omega. The wolf lunged. Something broke inside Leo. The docile nature he had been bred for, the softness Alaric had mocked, vanished. In its place was a jagged, raw desperation. As the wolf's jaws snapped inches from his face, Leo didn't scream. He didn't faint. He rolled, the adrenaline searing through his veins like liquid fire, and drove his stolen knife upward. The blade sank into the wolf's soft underbelly. Hot, iron-scented blood sprayed across Leo's face, steaming in the freezing air. The beast howled, a sound of pure agony, and collapsed. Leo scrambled back, gasping, his hands stained crimson, his chest heaving. He looked at his hands. He looked at the dead predator. For the first time in his life, he wasn't waiting for an alpha to save him. The leader, a massive alpha with a scarred eye, looked down at the blood-stained Omega in the tattered silk rags. He raised a spear, but Leo didn't flinch. He wiped the wolf's blood across his own forehead, his gaze defiant and freezing. The alpha paused, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. He lowered the spear. An Omega who kills a frostwolf with a dinner knife. Perhaps the North has a use for you after all. Chapter 4. The northern camp was not the primitive collection of tents Leo had been taught to fear in his tutor's history books. It was a fortress of bone, iron, and ancient stone, carved directly into the side of a jagged peak known as the Glaive of the North. Leo was dragged, not as a prisoner, but as a curiosity. His white wedding silk was now a gray, blood-stained rag, clinging to his shivering frame. The heat of the great central hearth hit him like a physical blow, smelling of roasting meat, pine resin, and the thick, musk-heavy scents of alphas and betas who had never known the refinement of a southern court. The scarred alpha who had spared him, a man named Kalon, threw a heavy cloak of white bear fur over Leo's shoulders. It weighed as much as a small child. "Eat," Kalon commanded, shoving a wooden bowl of thick, peppery stew into Leo's hands. In the north, if you don't burn calories, the mountain eats your soul by midnight. Leo ate until his stomach ached, his eyes darting around the hall. He saw Omegas here, but they weren't like the ones in Oakhaven. They didn't wear lace or practice the lute. They were sharpening spearheads, tanning hides, and barking orders at younger betas. "Why are they like that?" Leo whispered, gesturing to a scarred Omega woman who was currently out wrestling a beta twice her size. Kalon laughed, a sound like grinding stones. "In the south, they breed you to be pets. Here, an Omega is the heart of the storm. You have the highest endurance for the cold, little bird. Your bodies are built to hoard heat and survive the leanest winters. We don't protect our Omegos, follow them." Leo looked down at his soft, blistered hands. They were the hands of a decoration. "I want to be like them," Leo said, his voice cracking but firm. "I want the strength," Alaric said, "I didn't have." Kellen's eyes darkened. "Strength in the north isn't given, Leo of Valis. It's carved out of the ice. Tomorrow, you start the rites of the thistle. You will climb the frozen falls. You will learn to hunt the snow hares. And if you cry, the wind will turn your tears to glass and cut your face open." Leo looked at the fire, the orange light reflecting in his pupils. The maytake in his neck throbbed, a dull pulse of rejection. He reached up, fingers brushing the bare skin where the gold torque had once been. "I won't cry," Leo promised. That night, Leo slept on a bed of furs, the air thick with the scent of the pack. For the first time, he didn't dream of Alaric's golden hair or his false promises. He dreamt of the Frostwolf and the feeling of the blade sinking into its throat. He realized then that the weakness Alaric hated wasn't a lack of muscle, it was a lack of teeth. And Leo was starting to grow his. Chapter 5. 2 years in the northern mountains had stripped away the last of the southern lily. The soft, pale skin that Alaric once mocked was now a map of resilience faint. Silver scars from frost cats on his forearms and skin bronzed by the harsh, high-altitude sun. Leo stood at the edge of the Skyreach crag, looking down at the valley floor. He no longer wore silk. Instead, he was clad in layers of boiled leather and midnight black wolf fur. His hair, once kept in elaborate courtly curls, was now shorn short on the sides and braided back with shards of obsidian and bone. "The scouts have returned, my lord," a voice rumbled behind him. Leo turned. Kalon, once his mentor, now stood a respectful 3 paces back. In 2 years, Leo hadn't just survived. He had mastered the frost breath, a meditative combat style that allowed an Omega to regulate their internal heat, turning their perceived weakness into a weapon of endurance. He could outrun an alpha in a blizzard and kill a man with a needle made of ice before they even smelled his scent. "And?" Leo asked. His voice had lost its breathy tremor. It was now as cool and sharp as a glacier's edge. "The southern borders are collapsing," Kalon reported, handing Leo a scorched piece of parchment. "The Great Blight has taken their wheat. Their people are starving, and the King Laric's fatheress dead. Alaric has taken the crown, but he rules a graveyard." Leo looked at the parchment. It was a plea for safe passage for a trade caravan, stamped with the seal of Oakhaven. The golden lion of the southern crest looked pathetic against the backdrop of the howling northern wind. "He wants the mountain passes," Leo said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He wants the iron and the winter grain we've hoarded. The Council of Tribes wants to execute the envoys, Kalen added, his hand resting on his axe. They remember how the South treated us. They want blood. Leo walked toward the center of the camp. Thousands of Warriors Alphas, Betas, and Omegas alike stopped their sparring to watch him. He wasn't just a refugee anymore. He was the Frost King, the only soul capable of uniting the 13 warring mountain tribes. "No," Leo commanded, his voice carrying over the wind. "We won't kill the envoys. We'll send them back with a message." He grabbed a piece of charcoal and wrote a single sentence on the back of the royal plea. "The North does not negotiate with strangers. If the King of Oakhaven wants to save his people, he must come and petition the Frost King in person. On his knees. Send it," Leo said, tossing the parchment to Kalen. As the messenger rode off, Leo felt a strange thrum in his chest. It wasn't the Maytag he had long since frozen that part of his heart shut. It was the thrill of the hunt. The decoration was finally going to meet the decorator. Chapter 6. The air in Leo's private quarters, a cavernous suite, carved from blue-veined marble and lined with thick white furs, was thick enough to choke. Outside, the northern wind howled, but inside, the temperature had risen to a sweltering, unnatural degree. It had been 2 years since Leo's last true cycle. In the south, he had been suppressed with bitter herbs and cold baths, taught that an Omega's heat was a period of shameful vulnerability. But in the north, the heat was seen as a Phrygia time when an Omega's internal power reached its zenith. Leo groaned, his back arching against the furs. His skin felt like it was humming with 1,000 tiny needles of electricity. The scent of unusually like sharp ozone and mountain minthid shifted. It was now heavy, sweet, and primal, a musk that could drive a lesser alpha to madness. A heavy knock sounded on the iron-reinforced door. "My lord." Kellen's voice came through, strained and uncharacteristically raspy. "The guards? I've doubled the perimeter. The scent is reaching the lower barracks. Even the Betas are losing their focus." "Enter," Leo commanded. His voice was a low, honeyed rasp that surprised even himself. The door groaned open. Kalen stepped in, his hand gripped white-knuckled around the hilt of his sword. His head bowed. He refused to look up. Even as a seasoned northern alpha, the sheer potency of Leo's unfiltered command was a physical weight. "You're suffering," Kalen whispered, his nostrils flaring as he caught the full force of the scent. "The council? They say you should take a temporary consort to ease the fever." Leo stood up, his movements fluid and predatory despite the sweat slicking his chest. He walked toward Kalen, the white bear fur sliding off his shoulders. He didn't look like a victim of his biology. He looked like its master. "I spent my life being told my body was a weakness, Kalen," Leo said. Stopping just inches from the alpha, he could feel the heat radiating off Kellen's large frame, a tempting contrast to the mountain chill. "That I needed a mate to manage me." Leo reached out, his fingers tracing the scar over Kellen's eye. The alpha shuddered, a low growl vibrating in his chest, but he didn't move. He wouldn't dare touch his king without permission. "I don't want someone to ease the fever," Leo whispered, leaning in until his lips brushed Kellen's ear. "I want to feel every bit of it. I want to know that even when my blood is boiling, I am the one who holds the leash." The tension in the room was a living thing. Kellen's self-control was snapping, his breathing coming in heavy, jagged bursts. He looked up then, his eyes blown wide with a mix of reverence and desire. "You are terrifying, Leo," Kalen breathed. "Good," Leo replied. He grabbed Kalen by the collar of his furs, pulling him down not for a submissive kiss, but for a biting, dominant claim on the alpha's jawline. It was a display of sheer pheromonal dominance that left Kalen trembling. Leo pushed him back toward the door. "Now, go. Tell the barracks their king is not indisposed. Tell them I am merely gathering my strength." Because when the South arrives, I intend to be the hottest flame they've ever touched." Kalen bowed, his face flushed, and retreated into the hallway. Leo collapsed back onto the furs, a triumphant smirk on his face, even as the heat flared again. He had conquered the wolf, the mountain, and now his own nature. He was ready for Alaric. Chapter 7. The golden city of Oakhaven was no longer golden. The great blight had swept through the valley like a silent, invisible fire, turning the emerald wheat fields into blackened, rotting sludge. In the market squares where music and silk once traded, there was only the hollow cough of the hungry and the desperate whispers of a dying kingdom. Inside the palace, King Alaric paced the length of the war room. The opulence he once took for granted now felt like an insult. The heavy crown on his head felt like a lead weight, pressing down on the temples of a man who hadn't slept in a week. "The granaries are at 5%, Your Majesty," a gray-faced advisor murmured, keeping his distance. "The winter will take half the city if we don't secure the northern grain. The mountain tribes have moved their stockpiles into the high fortresses." Alaric stopped, staring at the map on the table. His gaze drifted to the jagged white peaks of the north and the envoy. What of the message? The advisor swallowed hard, sliding a scorched, charcoal-stained piece of parchment across the oak table. They sent a response, sire. But it was not from the tribal elders. It was from someone calling himself the Frost King. Alaric snatched the paper. As he read the sharp, jagged handwriting, the blood drained from his face. "The North does not negotiate with strangers. Petition the Frost King in person, on his knees." The handwriting was hauntingly familiar. It lacked the flowery loops of the southern nobility, replaced by a cold, efficient script. But the underlying structure was one he had seen 1,000 times in love letters he had once tossed into the fire. Leo Alaric whispered, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. "Sire?" the advisor asked, confused. "The Lord of Vallis. He died in the mountains 2 years ago." No Omega could survive a single night in the Black Pass. "He didn't die," Alaric said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. A key felt a sudden, sharp throb in his chest, long dormant ghost of a bond he had tried to sever. It wasn't a dull ache anymore. It was a beckoning. He remembered the way Leo had looked at the altar, shattered, small, and weak. He had rejected Leo to save his kingdom from a fragile leader. Yet now that very kingdom was crumbling while Leo sat on a throne of ice. "Prepare my guard," Alaric commanded, his eyes flashing with a mix of desperation and a dark, budding curiosity. "We leave for the north at dawn. I don't care if the passes are frozen shut. If he wants me on my knees, I'll give him what he wants so I can bring him back where he belongs." He reached for his heavy travel cloak, his hand trembling slightly. For 2 years, he had told himself he made the right choice for Oakhaven. But as he looked at the map, he realized the weak boy he had discarded was now the only man powerful enough to break him. Chapter 8. The ascent was a descent into hell. Alaric's elite southern guard, men who had won battles in the sun-drenched plains of the south, were being picked off by the environment itself. 3 horses had already been lost to hidden crevasses, and the thin air made every breath a struggle. Alaric rode at the front, his face wrapped in wool, his eyes narrowed against the stinging sleet. They crossed the Black Pass. The atmosphere shifted. The wind died down, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence. Suddenly, the mist parted. High above on the cliffs, figures appeared. They didn't look like the disorganized raiders Alaric expected. They were positioned with military precision, cloaked in white furs that made them nearly invisible against the snow. They held longbows made of weirwood, the arrows tipped with jagged obsidian. "Halt!" voice boomed from the crags. A massive alpha, Kalen, skidded down the slope on a shield of ice, landing effortlessly in front of Alaric's horse. The beast reared back, sensing the raw, predatory power of the northerner. "King Alaric of Oakhaven," Kalen said, his voice dripping with a mockery that made Alaric's blood boil. You've lost weight since your coronation. The South must be as empty as your promises. Alaric's hand flew to his sword. I am here to speak with your leader. I have no quarrel with his hounds. Kaelin laughed, and from the cliffs above, a chorus of guttural laughter joined him. The Frost King doesn't speak to men with swords in their hands. If you want to enter the ice fortress, your men stay here. Hugh, go alone, unarmed, and on foot. Sire, no. His captain of the guard protested. It's a trap. Alaric looked up at the fortress, a terrifying monolith of stone and ice that seemed to grow out of the mountain itself. He felt a pull, a magnetic tug at the base of his skull. The Bondake was screaming now, a frantic pulse that told him the person he had discarded was mere miles away. Stay here, Alaric commanded his men. He dismounted, unbuckling his gold-hilted sword and tossing it into the snow. Kaelin smirked, stepping aside. A wise choice. Follow the markers, and try not to freeze to death before he's done with you. It would ruin his fun. The walk was an exercise in humiliation. Alaric, a king who had never walked more than a mile without a carriage or a stallion, was forced to scramble over jagged rocks and through waist-deep drifts. By the time he reached the great iron doors of the fortress, his boots were soaked, his fingers were blue, and his pride was in tatters. The doors groaned open. The interior was lit by blue, ever-flame lanterns, casting long, dancing shadows. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasted venison, and a scent that stopped Alaric in his tracks. It was mint and ozone. It was Leo, but it wasn't the Leo he remembered. There was no scent of fear, no submissive sweetness. The scent was sharp, commanding, and so potent it made Alaric's head spin. He walked into the great hall, his heart hammering against his ribs. At the far end, seated on a throne of jagged black glass, was a figure draped in shadows and white fur. You took your time, Alaric, the figure said. The voice was lower, richer, and lacked any of the trembling affection Alaric had grown bored of. Alaric stepped into the light, and his breath caught. Leo sat with one leg crossed over the other, a silver-headed spear resting against his shoulder. His eyes, once soft and pleading, were now as cold and unforgiving as the mountain peaks. He looked down at his former mate with the bored curiosity of a god looking at an ant. Leo, Alaric breathed, taking a step forward. The name is King Leo. Leo corrected, his eyes flashing. And you are standing in my hall, uninvited and dripping on my floor. You were told the terms of this petition, Alaric. You're still standing. Chapter 9. The heavy iron doors thudded shut behind Alaric, the sound echoing like a gavel. He stood in the center of the vast hall, his breath hitching as he stared at the man on the throne. This wasn't the boy he had abandoned. This Leo had shoulders set broad and firm, skin glowing with the vitality of the harsh north, and an aura that didn't just invite attention, it demanded submission. You're alive, Alaric said, his voice a jagged rasp. He took a step forward, his hand instinctively reaching out. Leo, I thought. The report said you were lost in the drifts. Leo of Vallis died in those drifts. Leo replied, his voice smooth as polished ice. He didn't move an inch. The man before you owes nothing to Oakhaven. And you've forgotten your manners, King Alaric. In my hall, you are not a monarch. You are a beggar. Alaric's jaw tightened. The instinct to command was bred into his bones, but here, in this frozen cathedral of stone, his alpha dominance felt like a candle flickering in a hurricane. I have a kingdom of starving people. I didn't come here for a theatrical performance. I came for grain and steel. And you shall have them, Leo said, standing up. The movement was slow, feline, and dangerously graceful. As he descended the dais, the white wool fur cloak billowed behind him. He stopped just inches from Alaric. The scent hit Alaric like a physical blow, pure, unadulterated omega power, sharpened by the cold. It was intoxicating. Alaric's inner alpha roared, a primal urge to claim, to bite, to apologize, and to dominate all at once. But first, Leo whispered, leaning in so close Alaric could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You will acknowledge the debt. You called me a decoration. You said I would break at the first sign of winter." Leo reached out, his gloved hand catching Alaric's chin, forcing him to look up. The reversal was jarring. Alaric was taller, broader, yet he felt small under Leo's freezing gaze. "Look at me, Alaric," Leo commanded. "Does this look like a decoration to you?" "No." Alaric choked out. The maytake in his chest was no longer a dull throb. It was a wildfire. He wanted to grab Leo, to pull him into a bruising embrace, but the spears of the guards on the perimeter shifted in warning. "You want my help?" Leo's eyes dropped to Alaric's knees. "Then show me how much Oakhaven is worth to you." The terms were clear. The silence stretched agonizingly long. The great hall held its breath. Alaric, the king who had never bowed to any man, felt his legs tremble. Not from weakness, but from the sheer, overwhelming pressure of Leo's presence. Slowly, painfully, Alaric sank to one knee. The cold stone bit through his trousers, but it was nothing compared to the sting of his pride. He bowed his head, his golden hair falling over his face. I petition the Frost King for aid," Alaric said, the words tasting like ash. Leo looked down at the crown of Alaric's head, his expression unreadable. For a moment, a flash of the old Leoth, one who loved this man, flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the steel of the north. "A good start," Leo said, his voice airy and cruel. He turned back toward his throne. "But a bow only buys you a conversation. You will stay in the ice fortress for 3 days as my guest. You will eat what I eat, walk where I walk, and serve as my personal attendant. If you survive the 3 days without complaining, we will talk about your grain." Alaric looked up, his eyes burning with a mix of fury and a dark, twisted desire. "You want to humiliate me? I want to see if you're as strong as you claim to be," Leo countered, a predatory smirk playing on his lips. "Or if you're the one who breaks when the wind turns cold." Chapter 10. The Guest Quarters. Alaric was assigned were not the plush, velvet-lined chambers of the south. It was a cell of elegant stone, heated only by a small hearth and the sheer proximity to the Frost King's own suite. "Your first task, servant," Leo said the next morning, his voice cutting through the frosty air. He was dressed in a sleeveless tunic of dark leather, showing off the lean, corded muscle of his arms. The thermal springs. "My muscles are tight from the hunt. You will attend me." Alaric's blood simmered. He was a king, yet he found himself carrying a tray of oils and a coarse linen towel. Following Leo deep into the bowels of the fortress where the volcanic heat of the mountain met the ice. The springs were a subterranean paradise. Steam rose in thick, ghostly clouds, smelling of sulfur and minerals. Without a word of modesty, Leo stripped. He didn't hide his body. He displayed it. He was a masterpiece of survival, scarred, fit, and glowing with health. "The oil, Alaric," Leo commanded, slipping into the turquoise water and resting his arms along the stone lip of the pool. Alaric knelt at the water's edge. His hands shook as he poured the warm, pine-scented oil onto his palms. As he pressed his hands onto Leo's shoulders, a jolt of electricity, raw, unfiltered power of their broken bonds napped between them. Alaric let out a low, involuntary growl. "You're tense," Leo mocked, his eyes closed, though his nostrils flared at Alaric's scent. Alaric smelled of desperate alpha-sweet iron and a mounting, frustrated lust. "Is the work too hard for a king?" "You know damn well what this is doing to me," Alaric hissed, his thumbs digging into the knots in Leo's shoulders. He leaned down, his breath hot against Leo's wet skin. "You're playing with fire, Leo. You might have the mountains, but you're still an Omega, and I am still your my what." Leo spun around in the water, his hand shooting out to grip Alaric's collar, pulling the king's face down until their noses touched. "My mate, you threw that away. My master, look around you. You are the one kneeling in the steam, smelling of my perfume, begging for a trade route." Leo's eyes dropped to Alaric's mouth. The tension was a physical weight, thick enough to drown in. For a second, the mask of the Frost King slipped, and Alaric saw the raw, jagged hunger underneath. "You want me to break?" Alaric whispered, his hands sliding into Leo's wet hair. "But you're the one who can't stop looking at me." Leo didn't pull away. Instead, he let out a low, taunting laugh. He leaned in, his lips a hair's breadth from Alaric's. 3 days, Alaric. We're only on day 1. Let's see who's begging by the end of the night. Leo pushed off the wall, diving into the center of the steaming pool and leaving Alaric breathless, drenched in mist and dangerously close to losing his mind. Chapter 11. The moon hung high over the peaks, casting a cold, silver light through the high windows of the king's bedchamber. The room was a sanctuary of luxury and lethlighty white furs, obsidian carvings, and the faint, lingering scent of Leo's dominant Mintandozone musk. Alaric stood by the hearth, stoking the fire as he had been commanded. His royal tunics were gone, replaced by the simple, rough-spun wool of a northern servant. He felt the heat of the flames on his face, but it was nothing compared to the simmer in his veins. "The fire is high enough." Leo's voice came from the shadows of the massive, fur-laden bed. "Come here." Alaric turned. Leo was reclining against a mountain of black pelts, wearing nothing but a loose silk robe that fell open to reveal the sharp lines of his collarbones. He held a chalice of dark, spiced wine. "Your service today was adequate," Leo said, his eyes tracking the way Alaric's pulse thrummed in his neck. "But you still move like a man who expects to be served. Pour me another." Alaric took the carafe, his hand steady despite the storm inside him. As he leaned over to fill Leo's cup, Leo didn't take the wine. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing against the pulse point at Alaric's throat. The contact was electric. Alaric's breath hitched. "You're vibrating, Alaric," Leo whispered, his voice a low, honeyed lure. "The bond you tried to kill is screaming, isn't it? It wants what it was denied." "It wants you," Alaric growled, dropping the carafe onto the table with a heavy thud. He lunged forward, pinning Leo back against the furs. He expected Leo to fight, to call the guards, to freeze him out. Instead, Leo let a dark, triumphant sound. He wrapped his arms around Alaric's neck, pulling the alpha down into his scent-heavy space. "Then take it. If you have the strength to claim a king." The kiss was not an apology. It was a battle. It tasted of wine, winter, and years of resentment. Alaric kissed him with the desperation of a drowning man, his hands tangling in Leo's short, dark hair. He wanted to reassert the old order, to feel Leo surrender beneath him. But Leo didn't surrender. He flipped the position with a burst of northern combat instinct, pinning Alaric's wrists to the furs. He looked down at the prince, his eyes glowing with a predatory fire. "In the south, you thought you were the sun, and I was just the shadow you cast," Leo hissed, his lips grazing Alaric's ear. "But in the north, the sun is a distant memory. Here, the shadows rule. And right now, you are in mine." Leo leaned down, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin of Alaric's shoulder nape, quite a mating bite, but a claim. Alaric let out a choked sound, a mix of agony and ecstasy, as Leo's scent flooded his senses, overwhelming his alpha instincts and leaving him breathless and shivering under the Omega's absolute control. Leo pulled back just enough to look Alaric in the eye. "One more day, Alaric. One more day until the bow becomes a permanent position." Chapter 12. The third day began not with the chime of bells, but with the ringing of steel. As the sun hit the frost-covered windows, a faction of the ironclad traditionalists who believed the North should never trade with weak Southerners launched a desperate coup. They burst into the Great Hall during the morning council, their axes raised, shouting for a king who wouldn't sully their blood with southern grain. Alaric reacted instinctively. He lunged in front of Leo, his hands reaching for a weapon he didn't have, ready to shield the Omega with his own body. "Leo, get back." Leo didn't move. He didn't even flinch. "Stand aside, Alaric," Leo said, his voice a calm, freezing breeze. Before the lead assassin could swing his axe, Leo moved. He was a blur of black fur and silver steel. He didn't use a heavy sword. He used 2 daggers made of dragon glass. In a sequence of brutal, efficient movements, he disarmed the first man and brought the second to his knees with a strike to the throat. Alaric watched, breathless, as the man he once called fragile dismantled 5 elite northern warriors in under a minute. Leo stood in the center of the hall, a single drop of blood trailing down his cheek, his breathing perfectly steady. "The rebellion is over," Leo announced to the stunned room. He looked at the remaining conspirators. "Clean this mess. And then prepare the courtyard. We have a treaty to sign." An hour later, the entire Northern Army and the remaining Southern Guards stood in the central plaza. The wind whipped Leo's heavy white cloak as he stood on the raised platform. Alaric stepped forward, the treaty in his hand. He looked at his people, few guards he had left hand, then at Leo. He realized now that Leo hadn't just survived. He had become the very iron Alaric claimed to seek. "The terms have been met," Leo said, loud enough for both nations to hear. "The grain will flow. The South will not starve. But there is one final condition of the Frost King." Leo looked Alaric directly in the eye. The moment of intimacy from the night before was gone, replaced by the weight of a sovereign. "The South rejected me as a mate because they thought I was a burden," Leo declared. "Now, the South will accept me as an ally because they know I am their master, Alaric of Oakhaven." The bow in front of the world. Alaric didn't hesitate this time. He didn't do it because he was forced. He did it because he finally understood. He dropped to both knees, lowering his head until his forehead nearly touched the frozen ground. "I, Alaric of Oakhaven, swear fealty to the Frost King," he stated, his voice booming. "I acknowledge the North as our equal, and its king as the savior of my people." A roar of approval went up from the northern tribes. Leo looked down at the golden head of the man who had broken him, and for the first time in 2 years, the Maytake finally went silent. He wasn't the rejected queen anymore. He was the king who had conquered the man who dared to throw him away. Chapter 13. The blood moon hung low over the mountains, staining the snow a deep, visceral crimson. Inside the ice fortress, the fires roared high, celebrating the new alliance. But the private chambers of King Leo were quiet, save for the crackle of cedar logs and the heavy, charged silence between 2 men. The treaty was signed. The grain was moving. The politics were over. All that remained was the unfinished business of their blood. Alaric stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the red moonlight. He had regained his title, but he felt more like a subject than ever. When he heard the rustle of Leo's furs, he turned, his breath hitching. Leo had stripped away his armor. He wore a simple robe of sheer midnight blue silk that clung to the damp skin of his shoulders. The scent in the room was overwhelming, not the sharp, defensive frost of a king, but the deep, inviting heat of an Omega who was finally ready to reclaim what was his. "You don't have to stay tonight, Alaric," Leo said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "Your debt is paid. You could ride for the South at dawn." "I'm not going anywhere," Alaric growled, the sound vibrating from the depths of his chest. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping only when he was close enough to feel the heat radiating from Leo's chest. "I spent 2 years thinking I was the strong one. I was a fool. You didn't just survive the North, Leo, you mastered it. And I want to be mastered by you." Leo's eyes flashed. He reached up, his fingers sliding into Alaric's hair, pulling him down. "This isn't Oakhaven, Alaric. I won't be your consort. I won't be the quiet shadow behind your throne. I don't want a shadow. Alaric whispered against Leo's lips. I want a storm. When they collided, it wasn't the gentle, hesitant touch of their youth. It was a collision of fire and ice. Alaric's hands, rough from the mountain climb, searched the curves of Leo's back, pulling him flush against his body. The Maytake flared one last time before dissolving into a rush of pure, conked, golden heat as their scents finally merged cedarwood, ozone, and the deep musk of the hunt. Leo pushed Alaric back onto the bed of furs, pinning the alpha's shoulders down. He looked down at the king with a fierce, possessive hunger. Remember this, Alaric. When you feel the weight of your crown, remember the weight of my hand. You are mine by choice, not by blood. Alaric arched his back as Leo leaned down, his teeth grazing the scent gland on Alaric's neck. The pleasure was a physical wave, drowning out the cold of the mountains and the bitterness of the past. In the shadow of the blood moon, there were no kings or rejects, only two halves of a broken bond finally, violently, becoming whole. Chapter 14. The spring thaw had finally arrived, but it didn't bring the weakness Alaric had once feared. Instead, it brought life. The mountain passes were no longer guarded by soldiers with bared teeth, but by sentinels overseeing a river of trade. Southern grain moved north. Northern iron and medicine flowed south. Leo stood on the highest balcony of the ice fortress, watching a caravan depart. He felt a presence behind him, a scent of cedarwood and sunlight that no longer felt like a threat, but like home. Alaric stepped out, leaning against the stone railing beside him. He looked deferent. His face was leaner, his eyes wiser. He didn't wear the heavy, stifling robes of his coronation anymore. He wore northern leathers, the silver crest of Omegaverse pinned over his heart alongside a brooch of white dragonglass. The council in Omegaverse is asking when their king will return, Alaric said softly, his hand finding Leo's on the railing. Their fingers intertwined, the bond between them humming with a steady, peaceful resonance. And what did you tell them? Leo asked, a playful glint in his eyes. I told them the king is busy learning how to rule from a man who actually knows how to do it. Alaric replied with a smirk. He turned to face Leo, his expression becoming serious. They want to know if there will be a wedding, a real one. In the south, Leo looked out over his kingdom's rugged, beautiful peaks that had forged him into a weapon. I will never live in Omegaverse as a decoration, Alaric. I will not sit in a garden while you sit in a war room. I know, Alaric said, stepping closer, his forehead resting against Leo's. That's why I've ordered the construction of a second seat in the southern throne room. Equal height. Equal power. We will spend half the year in the frost and half in the sun. 2 crowns, Leo, not a king and his consort, but 2 kings. Leo felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the spring sun. He remembered the broken boy who had fled the cathedral in shredded silk, and he realized that the rejection hadn't been an end, had been an evolution. The rejected queen is a title the poets are already using, Leo whispered, pulling Alaric into a firm, grounding kiss. But I think I prefer the Frost King of the South. Alaric laughed, pulling Leo closer into the furs of his cloak. You can call yourself whatever you like, as long as you're mine. Yours, Leo challenged, eyebrows raised as he nudged Alaric back toward the bedroom doors with a commanding look. I believe we settled who belongs to whom on the night of the blood moon. Alaric grinned, following him without a second thought. So we did. Lead the way, my king. As the sun set over the liberated mountains, the bells of both kingdoms rang out. The era of the weak Omega was over. The era of the storm had begun.